The Chromi-alveolata, this is another one of the eukaryotic supergroups. It does contain a lot of different protists in it, and some of these protists are considered protozoans, so they're more animal-like, and then we have some that are actually going to be more plant-like, and they'll be in the algae category. So we're not going to talk about all of them that are listed here in this at this moment, but some that we do want to talk about are the apicomplexans. Within the apicomplexans, which we can see right here, these are going to all be parasitic. And we have some really big human pathogens that fall into this category. One of them is the one that causes malaria. So these are going to contain asymmetric cells. These asymmetric cells are going to have an apical complex, so this pointed side to it that is going to be specialized for penetration of cells. That is what we're seeing right here. We've got this pointed end. It's going to help this parasite to actually penetrate a host cell. If we're talking about malaria, this would be a protist that's able to penetrate the red blood cells. If we look at this life cycle right here, this is looking at malaria. And the malaria pathogen does have to reside in a couple different hosts to complete its life cycle, the human body and then also in the mosquito. And the key point when we're talking about the apicomplexans is that they do have this apex or apical complex. And notice how that is kind of pointing down and helping them to penetrate this human red blood cell. So that's going to be the way that they actually gain entry into their host. The ciliates are also one of the protozoans that we want to talk about in this group. These are characterized by being unicellular, so made up of only one cell, and they are covered in lots of cilia, and that's really where their name comes from. These cilia are going to just coat the surface, and we can see hundreds or thousands of them coating the surface over here, and they are going to create, in many cases, this little oral groove, so this indentation that's going to be used for feeding. And the oral groove is what we're seeing right here, and the cilia can help to kind of draw the food in as they move around. They're kind of gathering it into that oral groove for feeding purposes. Another key point of the ciliates is that they do tend to have a couple different nuclei inside of them. They have a macronuclei, which is going to be bigger, and then they also have micronuclei, which will be much smaller. Now, if we look at the structures here, or the cells here, we can see more details. They have the cilia all over the outside, which is where the name comes from. We can see the oral groove, which would be used for feeding. And notice that it is lined by cilia right here and down here, which is going to help to draw the food into the oral groove. Other things, we have the macronucleus, which is very large, and then we also have the micronucleus, which is going to be much smaller. If we look at the life cycle of the ciliates, one of the unique things about the ciliates is that they are able to exchange DNA with another cell, so with another ciliate, through the process of conjugation. So I'm just going to write that down here. Conjugation is going to be this process that they use, and we can see it happening right here, where they're actually going to swap or exchange nuclei with each other. And they'll be exchanging micronuclei with each other, and this is certainly going to promote genetic diversity in the ciliates if they are swapping nuclei. The oomycetes are going to be a fungal-like protist. The oomycetes, you can see in the picture right here, the white mass that we have, they look like fungi. They are heterotrophic. By heterotrophic, they're going to obtain their nutrients from other organisms. And these are unicellular, and then we also have some that are made up of multinucleate hyphae. And what this means is that it's filaments that don't have those cross walls between them. We can refer to that as senocytic, is another term that means that it's a mass of nuclei inside this one long filament. One thing that makes these different from the fungi is that the cell walls here are going to be composed of cellulose. So the cell wall is going to be around the cells. It's made up of cellulose. That's a different material than what we find in the cell walls of fungi. These are very important for breakdown of some dead organisms. So sometimes like fish, you might see ick is what sometimes people have in their aquariums. That is basically an oomycete on the outside. So that would be growing on the outside of the fish. Another place that this has played a very big role in human history is that it was an oomycete that was responsible for the Irish potato famine. And that's what we see on the potato down here. So Phytophthora is the actual name of the pathogen, but it is a plant pathogen, very significant when we're talking about potatoes, and there's many other crops that are attacked by oomycetes. So it does have great economic importance to humans. Another group of protozoans is the Excavata. So this is one of our supergroups. The Excavata are very unusual. These are going to be single-celled organisms, and their single-celled organisms are typically asymmetric, so they're not symmetrical. Other things about them is they don't contain any plastids, so no chloroplast or leucoplast, things of that nature. And they're going to have a depression on the surface, which is called an excavate. And that's really where the name comes from, Excavata. Other things about them is that they have very unusual mitochondria, sometimes lacking mitochondria or just mitochondria-like organelles. They lack DNA in their mitochondria, so that's one thing that makes them different. They lack electron transport chains and the typical enzymes that you would find in mitochondria. So very unique as far as their mitochondria go, and we'll see that different groups of them have structures that are similar to mitochondria, but they do have different names to them. One of the organisms that falls into the Excavata group that has human significance is Trichomonas vaginalis right here. You can see the asymmetric shape if you look at these cells. These contain what are called hydrogenosomes. That's their mitochondria-like structures. And these are significant to us as humans because they are responsible for a sexually transmitted disease. This is one where we do see a lot more symptoms in females, and we don't see so much in the way of symptoms in males, but males can certainly transmit this particular disease. Another group of the Excavata is the diplomonads. These are known by having that di part there, which is referring to their two separate nuclei that they contain. These also have mitosomes, that would be their unusual mitochondria, and they contain multiple flagella. In this particular group, Giardia is one that we do kind of pay special attention to because it does cause a variety of human illnesses. So it can be found in dirty water sources, so poor water sources, and it does cause diarrhea. You can see the asymmetric shape of Giardia here in this picture, and you can also see the multiple flagella very easily. A third group in the Excavata is going to be the euglenozoans. The euglenozoans are going to be mixotrophs, and as mixotrophs, this means that they can be autotrophic if conditions are desirable for that. So they do have a chloroplast that enables them to photosynthesize, and they can also be heterotrophic if there's no light available, if they don't have the necessary ingredients and supplies for the autotrophic behavior. These do have an eye spot. The eye spot is going to allow them to be very sensitive to light and to respond to light, and part of the response that they can have to light is to move towards it. They have two long flagellas that are going to help with that. And then they also have modified mitochondria called kinetoplastids. Here we have a life cycle of a euglenozoan. This particular one causes African sleeping sickness, and this one has a couple different hosts that it needs to reside in to actually complete the entire life cycle. Again, we say that with the protists, they're very unusual and they have a lot of variation in their life cycles. So this one, it does multiply and reside inside of human blood, lymph, and spinal fluid. And then this is basically leaving the human body when a tsetse fly actually feeds and bites the human. So the tsetse fly is going to have a blood meal. It's going to ingest this particular protist, and then the protist is going to multiply, complete part of its life cycle inside the tsetse fly. And then if that tsetse fly bites another human being, it can pass that protist back into a human's bloodstream, and then again it's going to multiply inside of the human being. Algae is the term that we use to refer to our plant-like protist. These plant-like protists are going to be autotrophic. So by autotrophic, this means that they are able to synthesize and make their own food, so their own organic molecules. and they can be either unicellular or they can be multicellular. Some of them are very small, some of them are actually quite large, so some of them are not really considered microbes. But if we're talking about them just as a group and pointing out some major characteristics of them, they do fall into two different supergroups. There are some that are part of this one, the Chromoalveolata, and then we also have some that are down here in the Archaea plastida. So we're going to talk about both of those and kind of some key characteristics of them. Before we do talk about them though, I will say that as a group, we do not tend to see a lot of pathogenic algae. And one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of pathogenic algae really has to do with the fact that they tend to be autotrophic. And since they're autotrophic, they're really obtaining their nutrients, their nutrition from the environment using sunlight, using carbon dioxide and materials such as that. So they don't really need to have a host to obtain their nutrients from. If we talk about one that does have some significance to us as a pathogen or as causing some illnesses to a variety of organisms, the Dinoflagellates certainly do. These are located right here at the top of this Chromoalveolata group. The Dinoflagellates, these are part of phytoplankton. So they're very important components of phytoplankton. They live in marine environments, and they're mostly unicellular. So as phytoplankton and as unicellular organisms, they're going to be very small. So they would be something that you would need a microscope to actually view. And they are characterized by having interlocking cellulose plates. The name we use for those cellulose plates is theca, and you can see them right here. These are the cellulose plates that we're talking about, and these can produce, some of them at least, can produce neurotoxins. So since they do produce neurotoxins, they can cause fish kills, so some widespread fish deaths if they're really abundant. They can also cause some problems for human beings as well, so the neurotoxins can do that. If we're talking about an abundance of them, they can also cause red tides. So these are your red tide organisms which do cause fish kills. The red tide comes from the fact that they do contain an abundance of a pigment called carotenoids. Carotenoids have a red or orange coloration to them, so that is why we get that name. And you can see the coloration that they produce in the water right here. In some cases, they're also bioluminescents, so they have kind of a fluorescence that they're producing. So those are our Dinoflagellates. Another group of algae that we have closely related are called the Stramenopiles. The Stramenopiles is a larger group. You can see here that it's actually including all four of these. And we've already talked about the oomycetes, which are fungal-like. But the plant-like ones, the Stramenopiles, we have heterotrophic and then also photosynthetic members. They have numerous hair-like projections on the flagella, so hairy flagella. It's pretty unique for them, and you can see that in the image here. And usually only the reproductive cells are going to be motile. So only the reproductive cells will have, say, the flagella on them that will enable them to actually move around. They do have chlorophyll A, which is similar to plants, and then they also are going to store their carbohydrates as what we call chrysolaminarin. This is different from what we would have in plants, and that's one reason why these are not considered plants. So they do have a different storage carbohydrate. The diatoms are one of these groups of Stramenopiles. The diatoms are also a component of phytoplankton. These are known for their unique glass-like walls, which are made of silica. We call that frastrules, the glass-like silica walls that they do have. These are extremely diverse, and you can see some of the diversity here just take on a lot of different shapes. Really pretty when you're looking at these underneath the microscope. And these are a component of diatomaceous earth. Diatomaceous earth is essentially little diatom bodies, so ones that have died and fallen to the ocean floor. And then this is used for a lot of gardening applications. It's also used as kind of a biological way to control insects and things inside the house, or slugs, snails, things of that nature. Some of these are responsible for some harmful algal blooms. When algae becomes very abundant, it does take away from some of the light supply, but it also produces nitrogenous compounds which can be detrimental to the aquatic organisms in that particular environment. Brown algae is going to be one of our larger algae. These are multicellular, and at first glance they really look quite a lot like plants. These are the big algae, the giant kelp that we do have in marine environments. You can see in this image here, here's a person, and you can see that this is basically an algae forest that he's swimming amongst. Okay, so the brown algae, just want to mention them here, but they're not really considered microbes, and there aren't any that are pathogenic. If we talk about our other supergroup of eukaryotes that contains the algae, that's the Archaea. The Archaea, these are significant because these are the things that are most closely related to plants. So since they are closely related to plants, they're going to have similar cell walls. They're going to be autotrophic organisms. The red algae, you can see them right here. They're going to contain a lot of multicellular forms. So as multicellular forms, these are going to look very plant-like. They are not going to be so tiny, but there are a lot of varieties to their forms. And then we also have the green algae. Green algae do have some unicellular ones, so we can see those right here. The unicellular ones would be microscopic, so they would be microbes, but they don't tend to be pathogenic because, again, they're obtaining their nutrients or nutrition from the environment. They don't need a host to do that. These are very similar to land plants. They have cellulose cell walls. They have chlorophyll A and B, which is what we find in land plants. And they also store their carbohydrates as starch, which is what land plants do. So just showing you on here, there is some diversity. We want to know that they're closely related to plants. There are some that are microscopic, but these are not going to be pathogenic to humans. They are, though, responsible for producing an awful lot of the oxygen that we do have in the atmosphere, which is something that's certainly beneficial to us. Parasitic helminths are going to be our animals that we're talking about in microbiology. This includes the roundworms, which is the nematoda, and then also the flatworms, which is platyhelminthus. These can be very small. They can be really large. One of the reasons why we do talk about them in microbiology is because the diagnostic stages of these are often eggs or larvae. So we do look at them oftentimes on microscopes to be able to distinguish what parasite might be affecting a particular individual or particular animal. These are considered animals themselves. So as animals, they are made up of eukaryotic cells. They are also heterotrophic. So by heterotrophic, that means that they need to obtain their nutrients by eating them or consuming them. And so this might be from a host organism. They are going to be multicellular, and they're also going to possess organ systems. So they might have primitive organ systems, but they're organ systems nonetheless. So they might have very primitive nervous systems. They might have primitive digestive systems. They're also, in many cases, going to have very complex reproductive cycles, and they might have a lot of their body actually devoted to the reproductive process. If we talk about the roundworms first, the roundworms are nematoda, and that's what we're looking at in this picture here. These are going to be unsegmented worms, and these unsegmented worms, they do have longitudinal muscles. So if I were to draw a worm right here, a nematode, the muscles run in this direction, so down the length of the body. And what that means is that when they move, they actually have this very unique movement. And it's really more of just a thrashing or whipping around. Very easy to see if we're looking in a microscope, and we do have some small nematodes there that we're viewing. These have a full or complete digestive tract. That means that there's basically two ends. We have the mouth, and then we also have the anus, which might seem like something that all animals would have, but actually it's not the case. Okay, so they do have a full digestive tract. Nematodes are extremely abundant. So this is one of our biggest groups of animals, actually. Most of them are super tiny, and they're not things that we would typically see and recognize as being present, but many of them are found in the soil. So there are nematodes all around in the soil. And then many of them are harmless to us. Some of them do cause a variety of plant diseases. So we can have plant pathogens. And we also have human and animal pathogens. Pinworms are the most common nematode infection in the United States. And that's actually what we're seeing in the image right here. The flatworms are platyhelminthus. The flatworms are just like the name says. They're very, very flat. The flatworms are one of those organisms that actually only has one opening to their digestive tract. So they have the same opening to basically take food in and then also to excrete waste. These, because of their very flat bodies, they actually absorb a lot of their nutrients from their host through that flat body. So the nutrients come in through the process of diffusion in many cases. The Platyhelminthes, these flatworms, there's three main groups that are included here. We have the flukes, the tapeworms, and also the turbellarians. We're not really going to talk about the turbellarians because we don't have a lot of pathogens inside that particular group. But the flukes are what we're looking at right here, and that's class Trematoda. And then we also have the tapeworms, which is over here, which is going to be Cestoda. When looking at these, they are obtaining their nutrients from a host, so they are pathogenic. They have a sucker that is going to help them absorb nutrients or feed on their host. So we can see that right here. We also have some multiple suckers down here on this tapeworm that we're looking at. And another thing to point out about these guys is they have what's called a scolex. This is the tapeworm specifically. And this scolex or head that they have oftentimes has hooks. These will help with attachment to the host. So the attachment to the host might be actually grabbing hold of, like a fish hook, really grabbing hold of the intestines of the host, so that they stay put and they're not moved out of the body or pass through the body because they're physically attached with that hook structure. Another thing, if we look at their bodies, the bodies of the flatworms are oftentimes filled with proglottids. These are going to be reproductive structures, so they have amazing reproductive capabilities. And what we mean by that is that they can produce a lot of eggs for producing new flukes and tapeworms. Here we have a look at a typical fluke life cycle. This particular organism, which is very characteristic, is going to need two different hosts to complete its entire life cycle. It does spend part of its life cycle in the human digestive tract, and then it also spends part of it in a snail. This one, the adults live in the human body. These are going to produce their eggs inside the human body, and then those eggs are going to be released in feces or in stool. These can then hatch and they can infect a snail, and then they will eventually perhaps be ingested by a human being so that they can then complete their life cycle again. The life cycle that we're seeing here is for a typical tapeworm. The tapeworm can also reside in a couple different hosts as it completes its life cycle. Humans oftentimes are infected by consuming undercooked or raw meat. And when they do that, they're actually ingesting the eggs, resistant eggs of the tapeworm. Once they do ingest those, then the eggs do hatch and they're able to grow into the adult tapeworm, which has those hooks, which allows it to attach to the intestines and basically remain in place. So that's a look at the tapeworm. Within the tapeworm, they do have a huge portion of their body filled with those proglottids, which are devoted to production of more eggs and basically just to continue their whole reproductive process.